Okay, so good afternoon. I would like to start by thanking the organizer of ALM28 for the invitation to be here today to share with you some of my ideas about numeracy, vulnerability, ethics, and social justice. This has been a central theme throughout my academic trajectory. Specifically, since I started my mathematics education work with the Brazilian Landless Movement 30 years ago. The ideas I will share with you today are based on this work that gave me not only a new way of looking at numeracy, but also a new perspective for my own life as a human being. I am showing you now pictures taken by the international well-known Brazilian photographer Sebastião Salgado, who published them in his book Terra, The Struggle for Land, Terra in Portuguese, land. And he said about the landless movement the following: landless movement for me is one of the last resistance movements in the world. These photos were given free of charge to the landless and to those like me who work with them. This is the cover of the book. As a starting point of my talk, let me present the argument I want to develop today. Over these 30 years, I could observe that the landless movement has gradually become less vulnerable, thanks to its own struggle strategies, among which education, in particular numeracy, is a central part. This is the central argument I want to develop today in my talk. To develop this argument, it's necessary to say some words about the landless movement and to show how its vulnerability is being mitigated. Brazil, like most countries, is marked by economic and social inequalities, which intersect with other cultural markers like gender, race, ethnicity, etc. Historically, due to the large concentration of land, Brazilian rural spaces were and still are areas of social conflict. Nowadays, 15% of the country population lives in rural areas, which corresponds to 30 million individuals. They are basically poor people with low level of instruction. In this landscape of centuries of poverty, that we can place the emergence of the Brazilian landless movement. It was founded in 1984. In its 37 years of existence, it has become the largest social movement in Latin America. It's organized in 24 states in the 5 regions of the country. And these regions have very different climatic, cultural, economic, and social characteristics. Regions located in the north and the northeast with more precarious social economic conditions than those in the south. The landless movements carry out long overdue land reform in a country where less than 3% 3% of the population owns 2/3 of the productive lands. This is amazing. 3% of the population owns 2/3 of the productive lands. It's a big concentration of land, which is one of the marks of the Brazilian social reality. Nowadays, there are approximately 120,000 families living in precarious camps awaiting government recognition. Very precarious. Brazil, like most countries, is marked by economic and social inequality. No. While living in camps, the landless peasants carry out farming activities and run schools to their children, youth, and adults. As you can see, in very precarious conditions. There are approximately 400,000 families living in settlements as a result of landless actions. And here are settlements, just pictures of settlements in the south of Brazil. Elementary schools in the landless settlements in the south of Brazil. Settlements in the northeast of Brazil, very poor areas. In more recent years, situations are changing. With regard to production, the landless movement recently has at organizational ways of production, 120 agro-industries, 1,900 associations of production, and 160 cooperatives of production. Nowadays, the landless movement is considered the largest producer of agroecological rice in Latin America. In 2019, landless settlers celebrated a harvest of 16,000 tons in the Brazilian in rice. Authentic Brazilian spirit produced by the landless cooperative in a fully agroecological way is exported to Europe. In times of pandemic, landless movement has been distributing food to poor communities across the country. To eat is a political act. 67,000 tons of food distributed in March 2021. The landless movement organized the FINAPOP. It's a popular funding movement. It's not a usual bank or usual investment fund. The investors are people who want to make their contribution to help the cooperatives to improve their production with lending at reduced interest. The landless movements have sectors, are organized in different sectors and collectives. Communication, culture, education, health, human rights, international relations, production, youth, children, gender, LGBT. This is the nowadays situation of the movement. gender sectors. It's very interesting. In the last March, they put the woman beautiful is the one who struggles. I found very interesting this. Then the last publication, Landless LGBT, Breaking Fences and Wiving the Freedom. The last, just launched in May this year. And here, in a march, in the fight against homophobia, Landless Youth calls for an end to violence. The Landless is also internationally known for its educational project. This educational project, which has been developed by the movement over its 37-year history, must be understood beyond schooling, since landless peasants educate themselves through their participation in the everyday life of their communities and also through the wide range of political activities developed by the movement. Their schooling projects, according to one of the Landless Movement official documents, consider the needs for two articulated struggles. First, to extend the right to education and schooling in the rural areas. This is the first, to extend the right to education. But the second is to construct a school that is in the rural area, but also belongs to the rural area. A school that is political and pedagogically connected to the history, cultural, social, and human causes of the subjects of the rural areas. The movement has dedicated itself to conceiving the schooling of its children, youth, and adults, paying attention to these two struggles. In particular, such struggles are providing the guidelines for its adult mathematics education. This means that the Landless educators considers peasant cultures a key issue also for those teaching and learning processes related to numeracy. But they explicitly mention that this valorization cannot deny the relevance of acquiring mathematics tools connected to what they call book mathematics that can improve the use of new technologies for managing production in rural areas. It can allow the learners to go further in their schooling trajectories. For me, it's very interesting. The first time I was teaching with a group of students and they call their mathematics, I will show you examples. Their mathematics, they call their practices, they call landless mathematics. And that's called school mathematics, they call the book mathematics. Of course, it's the mathematics which is found in the books, the written, the ones that has sufficiently value to be found in the books. And it's important to say that, unfortunately, macro-social constraints they are facing are really interfering in the implementation of those pedagogical principles. Even so, the educational project of the Landless Movement was developed and nowadays involves more than 2,000 public schools built in camps and settlements, 200,000 children, youth, and adults with access to education, 50,000 literate adults, 2,000 students in technical and university school courses, and more than 100 undergraduate courses in partnership with public universities around the country. This shows why I am saying that their vulnerability is going mitigating. For example, now I want to share with you how I perceive the place numeracy has occupied and still occupies in the process of mitigating the vulnerability of the landless movement. To achieve this goal, I will present some episodes relating to the ethnomathematics perspective I gave in the numeracy work I did with the landless over these 30 years. Using this strategy of presenting examples of my work, I follow Wittgenstein's late work with the importance the philosopher gives to examples. In aphorism 71 of Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein wrote, "Here, giving examples is not an indirect means of explaining, in default of a better." Wittgenstein gives a very important place to examples in his thinking. And then I'm following him now. So let's go back to the early 1990s when my work with the landless began. But first, I want to pay a tribute. When I started to conceive this talk, what first came to my mind were the two very dear colleagues, ALM honorary trustees, Diana Coben and Alison Tomlin. They followed me in those early years of my work with the landless, when this movement was still extremely vulnerable. Now is a special time to tell them how important their support was for me, even if they are not being in this conference. I would like to say that. Diana was with me in a landless settlement school, in a meeting in which the 7th grade students presented to the whole community the results of one of the phases of a 4-year project I developed in that school. I will show, I didn't plan to show that now, but I will show. Here is 2 pictures. Here is Diana talking to the students after the presentation. And here are the students. Here again, some pictures. Here is one of the peasants. Even my mother is here as well with Diana. Okay. No, wow, I did it wrong. So the project involved those students, settler families, school teachers, and also the agronomists who at that time worked at the settlement. The work carried was guided by an ethnomathematics perspective. The adult peasants, most of them with few years of schooling, also had the opportunity to be involved in the learning of mathematics. The adults were very much interested in participating in the project because it was about their own productive activities. As said a settler who was farming lettuce in greenhouse, one cannot work anymore just to let the devil have the last laugh. During that meeting, with the presence of Diana, in which the partial results of the project were presented, sometimes the arguments of the students once again were marked by the out of context, abstract, formal tone of the traditional school mathematics in dealing with the problems of the broader social world. But this coming back to the school mathematics routine was disturbed by some voices from the audience. There were settlers who demanded further explanations about numerical results, saying that, like this, we couldn't understand what you did. Bringing to scene their concrete life situations, these settlers helped the research group, composed by me and my master's degree students, to understand and problematize that displacement towards asepsis, formalism, apparent neutrality that produced a return to positions that the pedagogical work precisely sought to avoid. In enabling this polyphony of voices in the school curriculum, the project produced important elements to allow us to go further in our thinking about the ethnomathematics field. From that early period of my work with the landless, I would also like to mention a relevant practice in landless community in the past, and still today very much used in rural areas of Brazil. It's amazing how 37 years later, I still find the necessity of work when in my work with the landless communities with this practice. It consists of estimating the area of what is called a piece of land. They call it land cubasa. Precisely because it is relevant, it is a term which was and still is always requested by the participants in numeracy project as a focal point of study. I learned from my landless students their methods of land cubasa. Their methods, as compared numerically with those used by school mathematics, produce approximate results, an approximation upwards. These upwards approximations are the smaller, the closer the shape of the land is to a square. And in this case, coincide with official results. Before presenting the example, I need to make an important methodological caveat. I am aware of the theoretical difficulties involved in expressing landless mathematical practice using school mathematics. From an anthropological point of view, this type of translation, mathematical landless practices in mathematical school language is very problematic. Making this translation, I have done, in other words, as I have done, in other words, is only to favor a faster understanding. I am aware that in doing so, some or maybe most of the specificities that constitute the landless forms of life which produce the practices of land incumbation are suppressed. So it can be said that those methods become hostages of the school mathematics. Later on, I will come back to this point. It's a very delicate point from the theoretical perspective. But so, having taken these precautions, allow me to present an example that for many reasons has only traces of the methods of land cubation practices by the lands. But first, allow me to show two peasants teaching their methods to me, the first in a camp and the other during a class, just to show me two pictures. It's in order to give you an example of how this is landless peasant explaining land cubation. This is I found important because this is the situations themselves where this teaching and learning process happen. Here is in a camp, and here is during a class when this peasant was teaching to me and to his colleagues the land cubation methods he knew. So here is this so artificial land. After I will explain why I presented to them this example. Let's assume this is a land. Adam's method of land cubation. This is a piece of land with 4 walls. They consider the sides of the land, they call walls. First, we add 2 of the opposite walls and divide them by 2. After, we add the other 2 walls and also divide them by 2. Then we multiply the first obtained numbers by the second one. This is the cubation of the land. Mathematically expressing them is there. This is the formal way of expressing that. And then George's method of land cubation. Here is a piece of land with 4 walls. First, we add all the walls. After, we divide the sum by 4. Then we multiply the number obtained by itself. This is the cubation of this land. It's clear that the method of Adam is to make a rectangle. And the method of George, he makes a square and calculate the area of the rectangle, and then George, he makes the area of a square. This polygon was the artificial piece of land that I presented to the first group of landless students I had. Given their difficulties in understanding the results of those different methods of calculating the area of polygons. And here is the book mathematics method of this area. And it's clear. This is why I brought to them this so different, because this is a strip, a very, 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 and then it's a so artificial piece of land. But it's an extreme, to bring an extreme difference. Despite the great tension caused in the classroom, the results of the landless methods, which give values so much higher than those given by school mathematics, allowed an important discussion about the comparisons among their own methods and the school mathematics methods, which included the learning of the Heron formula of calculating polygonal areas, a formula that requires only the lengths of the polygonal sides. In fact, when the land is not a flat geometrical figure, which is almost always, but a real concrete land, its undulations offer much more surface for cultivation. Thus, depending on the shape and undulations of the land, the increased result given by the peasant methods can be suitable. Their methods lead them to obtain a value closer to that to which effectively corresponds to the surface that can be cultivated. First, Alison Tomlin showed me her work. Politics and landless measurement. And I, very pleased with it, later on presented it to Adam, Jorge, and their classmates. They were visible, very proud, and said, now even in Europe, they know that we also do mathematics. And I have to say to you that I was deeply moved by their pride. After some time in a field work, I learned with a landless peasant another way of land cubasa. He used as parameter to determine the size of a surface the tractor time used to hoe. One placed the tractor on the land. Working with it for 3 hours, it makes exactly 1 hectare. This practice emerged as one among many examples of peasant ways of living in the south of the country. It was a way of living marked by material vulnerability, where the small farmers' work rarely managed to compete with the landowners. Thus, the cost of production, particularly the amount to be paid for the leasing of the machinery, was a central point. These were the conditions that give meaning to the rule that associated time-space, which characterized that practice. In the context, the precision, the exactitude of the area to be cultivated was no longer relevant. The landless practice produced an approximate result. It's not exact. But, as said Wittgenstein, inexact does not mean useless. Precisely, this is the point. At this point, I want to highlight some theoretical elements that support my ethnomathematics perspective. As it is well known, it is considered that ethnomathematics had its beginning with the contributions of the Brazilian educator Ubiratã D'Ambrosio, unfortunately dead last month. I would like to pay my tribute to him, a very, very close friend and a very important academic and human being that we lost last month. Its constitution as a field of knowledge, ethnomathematics, covers a broad, heterogeneous spectrum of approaches. Among them, based on the 30 years work with the landless movement, it's found my approach. Having emerged in peripheral countries in recent decades, issues examined by ethnomathematics have come to interest mathematics educators of central countries. This because migratory movements have increased worldwide, leading to many immigrant children being schooled in global north countries, such as those belonging to the European Union. Most of their families can be considered functionally illiterate, which makes it even more difficult for youth and adults to find jobs that can allow them to have a decent life. The field of education, and particularly mathematics education, gain awareness of the need to pay attention to this socio-cultural phenomenon that has concrete repercussions in schooling and broader social context. One of the most significant trends in mathematics education that express this awareness is ethnomathematics, precisely because it does not only pay attention to cultural diversity, but it pays attention to how this cultural diversity works on the students' subjectivities, how mathematics education, in particular numeracy, can favor or not the students' subjectivation process in a way that allows them to value their culture, their forms of life, their social practices, which includes their ways of practices, what we call their mathematical practices, because we identify similarities with our school mathematics practices. In terms of subjectivation processes, we can think that identifying and analyzing mathematical practices of their reality operates in our students, in ourselves, as a technology that in principle can offer conditions for us to become human beings who perceive the other, the different, with less contempt, with more empathy. I believe that in times of racism, faces, religious, political, gender, and sexual intolerance in which we live today, mathematics education can contribute to a more inclusive society. The author who helps me most in thinking about ethnomathematics is Wittgenstein. More precisely, the second Wittgenstein, who most well known for his work, Philosophical Investigation. Wittgenstein's work challenges the existence of a universal language in the notion of total rationality. Wittgenstein points to the constitution of various criteria of rationality. the philosopher considers the existence of many languages which acquire meaning according to their use. He conceives language games as social practices for him to describe objects and to tell stories. For example, these social practices are what he calls language games. So we can say that to calculate the areas of surface, like George methods, like Adam methods, also can be considered language games. To establish the meaning of the word gestures, and when might say the meaning of the practice, the meaning of a language game and their rationality are produced in the context of a given form of life. And as Glock explains, the notion of a formal life, the context, we can say the culture, the specific context, cultural context. What is a formal life for Wittgenstein? Expresses the intertwining of culture, worldview, and language. Thus, the possibility of essence, of fixed guarantees for a language is questioning, leading us to problematize the existence of a single mathematical language with fixed meaning. This is why we can admit the existence of peasant mathematics language games. Thus, based on the later work of Wittgenstein and some of his interpreters, it can be argued that different forms of life produce different language games. So we can ask, is there some kind of relationship between different language games? If the answer is positive, how do they relate? And the response of these questions was provided by Wittgenstein's late work through the notion of family resemblances. The philosopher considers that language games form a complicated network of similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing, sometimes overlap similarities, sometimes similarities of detail. And this Wittgenstein argument allows me to call the Adam's methods and George methods of land cubation mathematical methods of calculating surface areas, since they have family resemblance with the book mathematics methods of calculating surface areas. This for me is very important because people say, why are you calling mathematical these practices? Because they have similarities of what the school mathematics following Wittgenstein. They have something that is similar to ours. And then they have family resemblance following Wittgenstein thinking. But now, let me extend my thinking beyond the land cubation and ask, what happens when we take it for granted that it's important to bring reality into mathematics class? What have we been doing in this work of schooling practice out of school, outside the school? I want to repeat because I didn't read properly. What have we been doing in this work of schooling practices outside the school? This is something very, very useful in the ethnomathematics approach, but not only in math education and usually. What have we been doing in this work of schooling practices outside the school? If we listen to Wittgenstein teachings from philosophical investigation, we will see that the domestication of mathematical practices of non-school forms of life, this means when these practices are transported to school form of life, is an unsuccessful operation. They are captured by the school machinery, becoming school practice and not, as one might ideally wish, practice of the reality, which, in an intact way, would be introduced into the school. This is because out of school and school practices in a Wittgensteinian language, the language games of non-school forms of life and those practiced at school are governed by different logics. And when crossing the bridge from one form of life, the out school life, and another to another form of life, the language games necessarily undergo transformations. This is why it is so hard and sometimes so frustrating to work in an ethnomathematics perspective. And also, it's so hard to describe an ethnomathematics work as I'm trying to do here. For example, it requires deep field work and careful transcription that allows to preserve in detail the language in which the peasants express their practices. This is what I was referring before and criticizing myself in trying to express the land, the George and Adam land cubasa practices. And just as important, it is important to make clear to the students the peasant language games are marked by immanence, and those of book mathematics language games are marked by the transcendence of mathematics. Both have different logics. Therefore, we have to be cautious when saying to our students that we teach school mathematics to be applied in everyday life and at work. This is a very radical statement I am assuming, but this is my position. We have to be cautious when saying to our students that we teach school mathematics to be applied, because the language games of outside schools are different. They have different logics that because the school mathematics have maintained the logics of the transcendence of mathematics. Let me present another example. It's linked to an episode that happened during fieldwork done some years ago. A peasant explained that on estimating the total value of what he would spend to purchase inputs for production, he rounded numbers upwards, ignoring the cents, since he did not want to be shamed and he's short of money when time comes to pay. However, if the situation involved the sale of some product, the strategy used was precisely the opposite. In this case, rounding was done downwards because, as he said, I don't want to fool myself and think that I would have more money than I really have. This is a very simple example how the logic, the contingency of the outside world is different from the situation of the school mathematics. Because the school mathematics, what we teach at school is a rule that is universally valid And this is mathematics. Mathematics is universal. Mathematics is from the order of transcendency. This is mathematics. You have to make very clear to the students, mathematics is one thing, the real life is another, because it has a transcendence, a immanency. It depends on the situation. Different practices, they have similarities. They have similar, but they are not the same. We are not going to apply precisely the mathematics rules outside, because outside things work differently. This is my position. I will skip some other examples, and I will end with a last one, with a no successful example. I appreciate very much to bring no successful examples, because usually it is said that in education we always present successful stories. And I think it's important to present non-successful stories. And here is an example of that. So the episode I will bring refers to a higher education course in technology of management of cooperative, higher education. And this is why I'm saying that in this 30 years working with the landless, I could observe, it's amazing how now they have higher education courses. It's amazing. So, and this is a higher education course in technology of management of cooperatives, in which, different from the other examples before presented, we face difficulties in using our ethnomathematics approach in the numeracy process. The main challenge of the course was to advance in agricultural cooperation, introducing the management of cooperatives in the neoliberal business model. You see, in the management of cooperatives in the neoliberal business model, but taking into account that such advance needed to be subordinated to the political and social positions defended by the movement in its history. The course had in itself a contradiction, and this was the big challenge of the course. The course, lasting 3 years, aimed to train 40 technicians of the landless movement and other peasant movements in Latin America, and was run by the Landless Movement education sector in partnership with the Universidade de Mondragón in the Spanish Basque country. This university was in charge of the teaching of the subjects linked to technology and business management. Nevertheless, when the course started, its pedagogical team noticed that the students had difficulties in following the subjects accounting and financial management, which are central in the course curriculum. They considered that these difficulties were due to deficiencies in mathematics. Thus, the pedagogical team took the decision to introduce a subject of mathematics in the course, though this had not been foreseen before. The mathematics syllabus was elaborated by the Basque teachers, who taught the accounting and financial business subjects and included percentage, fractions, equations, areas, and volumes, for example. We were invited to be in charge of the teaching, and one of my students was the teacher. If we analyze in a global way, the first course of technology of management of cooperatives promoted by the Landless Movement, we can affirm that its results were very positive. Its repercussions in the productive sector of the Landless Movement were notorious. However, from a numeracy point of view, which is what I am interested to examining here, the course can be criticized. The fact that the students' difficulties were not foreseen, and therefore there was not enough time for them to be worked on throughout the teaching of the subjects accounting and financial business, implied that the numeracy was carried out separately. This in itself made it impossible to. If we analyze in a global way, the first course of technology of management of cooperatives promoted by the Landless Movement, we can affirm that its results were very positive. Its repercussions in the productive sector of the Landless Movement were notorious. However, from a numeracy point of view, which is what I am interested to examining here, the course can be criticized. The fact that the students' difficulties were not foreseen, and therefore there was not enough time for them to be worked on throughout the teaching of the subjects accounting and financial business, implied that the numeracy was carried out separately. This in itself made it impossible to implement the ethnomathematics perspective that until then had been central to our work. Numeracy ended up being restricted to something very routine, a list of contents to be taught with the purpose of being applied after. And we know how inefficient is this pedagogical approach after learning from Wittgenstein what he said about the notion of use, that the meaning is given based on the use we make of it, different situations and contexts, that the meaning is determined by the use. And then this first learn the theory and after apply, we knew in advance that it will be almost impossible, the successful of this kind of work. But there is one more aspect that can be criticized in the course from the standpoint of numeracy. The subjects of accounting and financial business, which can be considered themselves in some way as numeracy, were taught by the Spanish Basque teachers in a very traditional way. The methodology, first theory and then application, was implemented. And we can see that we were submitted to the Basque University methodological perspective. At the end, we were submitted to them. I say me and my master's degree students and so on. At the end, we were very frustrated with this experience. The last topic I want to mention, and I'm ending my presentation, refers to my ethical concern as a researcher and as a human being who wants to contribute to a better world. I always knew that having found a social movement like the Landless Movement, with whom to develop my academic work, was a privilege. I am aware that the landless peasants have taught me much more than I have taught them. Not just about their mathematics language games, but about their generosity, their detachment in putting their collective above individual interests, their tireless strength to fight for a more just world. Throughout my trajectory as a researcher, I have always tried to mobilize all my efforts in order to never forget to problematize my own discourse, since it is necessarily marked by my privileged voice as an intellectual working with what can be seen even today as subaltern subjects. In my attempts, I have been favored by this social movement, which are very much aware of the risk of exposing themselves to academic research and of being narrated by the others, of being represented by us. They chose to take this risk, not only because of my good intentions of being vigilant about my role in this work. I have been developing with them for decades. They took this decision because they put education as one of their key issues of their struggle and see the importance of having academics contributing to the construction of new alternatives of their educational project. To end my talk, I choose an excerpt taken from an interview given by Edgar Morin, published in the Italian magazine Avvenire last year, when the advance of COVID-19 had already started the devastating tragedy that soon afterwards come to be confirmed. This is an interview in which the philosopher was encouraged to reflect on the moment we are living and how he saw our prospects for the future. Here is the excerpt. Here it is. The last slides must work. We live in a triple crisis: the biological crisis of a pandemic that indiscriminately threats our lives, the economic one born of restricted measures and death of civilization, with the abrupt transition from a civilization of mobility to the obligation of immobility. A multiple crisis that should provoke a crisis of political thought and a thought itself. Perhaps a healthy existential crisis. We need a regenerated humanism, which searches for the sources of ethics, solidarity, and responsibility present in every human society. Essentially, a planetary humanism. Positions such as those expressed by Edgar Morin can inspire us to think and act within the scope of ethics and solidarity in times of crisis, can lead us to exercise the fullness of our humanism, contributing to the construction of a more egalitarian, anti-racist, anti-homophobic, anti-patriarchal, anti-xenophobic, anti-racist, anti-just society. I am convinced that ALM, through its work in the field of mathematics education, is providing an important contribution in this direction. Thank you.